all in the School of Liberal Arts and Social Science, SLAS, the home of class as we call it, inside Independent University, Bangladesh. The all-day conference addresses 4 Rs and 3 questions that we ask. So before I go to our honored guests and our esteemed peers, let me just say a few words about them. The 3 questions are certainly the ones that are foremost in our minds. What must be done, or what is being done? How is it unfolding? And eventually, where will all these lead us? The 4 Rs, first one will be reality, ground realities. It does not look like the Rohingya refugees will be going anywhere in the near future. Can we absorb them? Do we have the capacity to look after them? What about local community relations? These are the issues we should think about along those lines. The second one has to do with relief. And there's an enormous amount of relief being channeled, but as is always the case, the demand is a lot higher than the supply. How long can this go on? And the other more troubling question is that relief is becoming more institutionalized than the solution of these problems. So what can we all sit down and think about and do? The third R would be reform. Reform is taking place in many big ways. For example, education. We have education in emergencies, a new program. And today being the International Education Day, I do want to highlight that. We do have a panel later in the day on the topic. But like education, sexual or gender, dignity, balance, sensitivity, these are also becoming more important than ever before. And certainly if you remember Bangladesh's refugees of 1971, we had none of these. So there is growth and there is a lot of reform, but what can we get out of them? The fourth one, the fourth R we have is also controversial. It is the relocation. And therefore what we do with the Bhashan Char idea, how we get it going, is the questions we will be addressing today. Our guests, we have 4 of them, and we are going to begin in this order. I'm going to mention them now and then leave it to each of them later. The first is our High Commissioner for Great Britain in Bangladesh, His Excellency Mr. Robert Chatterson Dixon. He's our chief guest. We will have also the Chief of Mission of the International Organization for Migration. Please excuse me if my spelling or pronunciation is not correct, but Dr. Georgi Gigori. Following him will be the Assistant Representative of the United Nations High Commission for Refugee, Ms. Fumiko Kashiwa. And then we will have the fourth and final guest who will be our discussant, Dhaka University's iconic international relations professor, Dr. Imtiaz Ahmed. I would like to turn next to our 3 esteemed peers in this university, and I'd like to begin with our Vice Chancellor, acting Professor Dr. Milan Pagon, if you don't mind to please come and begin your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, Now it works. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests. Good morning and welcome to IUB. We are dealing with a very, very important issue here, Rohingyas, and the tragedy that they're going through. Now, as I wrote in my message in the brochure that is in front of you, we live in the world where almost every discussion about any situation that is happening nowadays starts with the words, who would have ever imagined? And doesn't matter whether it's coronavirus or the situation in the US or the Rohingya crisis. People would say, who would have ever imagined? But the fact is that we could have and we should have imagined, because the history repeats itself. Good morning. The history repeats itself, but we fail to learn from history all the time. We always fail to learn. Why do we fail to learn? Well, see, I'm sure that many of you have heard of the concept cognitive dissonance. How many of you have heard about cognitive dissonance? Let me see, show of hands. Okay, so few people have heard about it. Cognitive dissonance is a state of mind when there is a conflict between our behavior and our attitudes. And we people don't like to live in dissonance state. So we have to solve it somehow. And which one is it easier to change? Your behavior or your attitude? What do you think? It's the attitude, yes. Because behavior is hard to change. It takes a lot of effort. You can change your attitude easily. So whenever we find ourselves in cognitive dissonance, in most cases, we change our attitude. And because of that, we are fine with a lot of bad things going around us. We tolerate a lot of things that are happening because we change our attitudes toward them. We say, oh, they brought this upon themselves. Oh, you know, a lot of them are criminals, see what they're doing and so on. We change our attitude and we feel fine with not doing anything about it. The role of social science is very, very important here. We need to study the history, both the far back history and the the recent history, and learn from that. And only then we can recognize these ominous signs that something bad is about to happen. And the best way to deal with this cognitive dissonance is to face the situation yourself. We're having some problems with the sound here. A few years ago, when the crisis with Rohingya started, IUB was the first university to respond and organize aid, and I personally led the team. We went down to Teknaf and we distributed the relief among the Rohingyas. And when you are there, when you see the suffering of those people, when you listen to their stories, then there's no cognitive dissonance there. Then you realize how bad the situation is and how necessary it is for something to be done. We were handing out heavy bags of rice, and there was a lady, a tiny lady, with one infant in her lap, or in her hand, who came to get that heavy bag of rice. And through interpreter, translator, I asked her how come that she came alone, not her husband, not somebody from her family. And she responded that there is nobody, it's just her, because she witnessed her family being killed, her husband being killed. It was just her and a small baby. And when you see that, then you understand the tragedy of what is happening with Rohingyas. The conference like today's is of utmost importance because we need to prevent one thing from happening, And that thing that is happening all the time is when there is suffering for a few days, maybe for a few weeks, it makes the news. And then we get used to it. Then we don't respond to it anymore. You open the newspaper, you see something about the event that's been going on for a few weeks, you just skip it because you already know that. We become desensitized, and we need to prevent that. Conferences like this serve that purpose. We need to keep reminding people, we need to keep reminding the policymakers, the decision makers, that there is a problem that needs to be solved, and show them the way how to solve it. So I do hope that this conference will open some new questions, but also offer some answers how to solve this unfortunate crisis, these unfortunate situations. Thank you all for coming, and let's all hope that we will be productive. Thank you.
I would like to invite our Chairman, Board of Trustees, Mr. Motin Chaudhary, to come and share a few words with us. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Very pleased to see that IUB is organizing this. I just found out there are 30 speakers who are going to speak on the subject today, all very eminent experts. And I have nothing to do with this or know anything about it, so I don't think I would like to stay on the subject at all. I will leave it to the other people, and I would rather listen to them. I would just like to share, the pandemic and IUB on a different subject, if I may, not really on the topic of the Rohingyas, because there is such a lot of experts who are going to come. I would rather listen to them than say anything about this. Well, IUB has been doing well during the pandemic. Our team has worked very hard, and we've had our online classes, and we've met all our courses and examinations. So congratulations to the team. Our admissions have been well. We've been on target. We still have people coming in to study here because we handled the pandemic situation very well. So that was something which we did very well, that we had adapted to change, and that worked out. So I would appreciate if all of us continue this effort and carry on with this, because the future is still very uncertain. We still haven't come to a position where we can do predictions. So I'm happy to see that we've come thus far, but we need to go further. On Bangladesh, I think our challenges have been dealt very well. I am from the industry, and the government and the Prime Minister in particular had very hands-on operations, and we are probably one of the most successful countries to have dealt the pandemic in terms of trade. In terms of trade, our employment numbers are not as you read in the paper, because what the paper is saying are some businesses will go off, and some businesses have gone off. But a lot of new opportunities have come up, and a lot of new jobs have been created. So when I look at the market, it's still a balanced situation. So, jobs have been maintained, people have been paid, and the government had just loaned us. When I was looking at the US packages and the UK packages, which are accessible to us, there are forgiveness to the money. In Bangladesh, there has been no forgiveness to the money. The government has loaned a certain amount of money, which the industry is going to give back. So that way, I feel very proud that this matter has been handled, and nobody went without food during this period, because I've had connectivity all over the country in different areas, and I heard that, so I can say that. So that's why I feel very proud that we've done very well. The British High Commissioner is here. I would like to thank him for joining us here. They have been supportive to education, and I have been a beneficiary, because as the chairman of USEP, USEP is an organization which UK aid has been supporting us for the last 30 years. And it's been a very successful program where underprivileged children are given primary education and then technical education and then put into jobs. So thank you very much for supporting it. And I'm sure as we progress further, we would look for support and cooperation in terms of giving us access to faculty, giving us access to knowledge. Here we are not looking for financial support, but we would be looking for support which could take us forward in linkages and other things. So I'm sure you'd find ways. So with all that, I would wish the conference well, and I would like to thank the organizers and everybody else. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman Motin Bhai. I'm happy to go to our next trustee, architect Niloufar Zafarullah, who has just become chairman of our EST CDT, that is Education, Science, Technology, and Cultural Development Trust. Welcome, Architect Zafarullah, please.
Thank you, Dr. Imtiaz. Assalamu alaikum, respected chief guest, special guests, vice chancellor, distinguished guests, and dean, Dr. Imtiaz A. Hussain, today's moderator, at the inaugural session of the program on the Rohingya Big Picture, being held at the multipurpose hall at IUB. A very good morning to you all. Rohingyas have a history, and they had a land. It began in 1948, a year after the partition of India. Myanmar, then known as Burma, got its independence from the British rule. Since then, the Rohingyas, a tribal group from the Rakhine state of Myanmar, were termed as illegal and migrants from erstwhile East Pakistan. Before Bangladesh became independent, the Pakistan government did nothing to challenge this crucial matter. The fate of the Rohingyas remained same and worsened as they faced systematic tortures and exclusion from all form of human rights and protections rendered by a country to its citizens. They gradually became stateless, facing regular violence from militant Rakhine Buddhists. For decades, the Rakhine state witnessed persecution and discrimination of Rohingya Muslim community under the surveillance of the Myanmar military regime also. Singled out as a minority group in its own country, Myanmar, clashes with the Rakhine Buddhists became more frequent. The Myanmar military occupation seized their land in the name of development work for extraction of mineral resources and exploration of natural gas, of which the border state of Rakhine is known for. The vulnerability of their livelihood and dominated ethnic minority were forced to migrate to neighboring Bangladesh since the late 70s in considerably large groups. Eventually to escape mass killing in a form of ethnic cleansing by government forces, sporadic mass exodus of Rohingyas into Bangladesh became more visible. From 1980 to 2005, the volume of immigrant Rohingyas grew in greater numbers, entering Bangladesh in different times. An estimated of 400,000 illegal Rohingyas were residing and roaming around in Cox's Bazar, Bandarban, Khagrachari, and Rangamati for survival. From 1996, the Bangladesh government earnestly began to identify the illegal immigrants and grant them status as refugees. The refugee camps in Cox's Bazar were recreated to meet proper living conditions and facilities by the government, aided by some of the international agencies who had set up office in Bangladesh. Despite the large population and limited land resources, Bangladesh understood the plight of the fleeing Rohingyas and welcomed them to their temporary homes. The recent influx of refugees after 2017 added to the existing number by 1 million plus, populating the coastal region of Bangladesh more and more in number. Despite efforts taken by the government for containing the displaced population of Myanmar, an estimated of 1,500 acres of forest were destroyed and further hilly areas of forests were under destruction to create more shelter for the latest assemblance of refugees. Cox's Bazar, the prominent tourist district of Bangladesh, was hit badly due to the Rohingya exodus as the great source of tourism came to a risk. This had a direct influence on our GDP growth. The refugees had also acquired Bangladeshi passports illegally and managed to take up jobs in Saudi Arabia. Eventually, towards 2009, this practice was rectified when it became compulsory for migrant workers to possess MRPs, that is machine-readable passports, to travel and hold jobs. In this process, most Rohingyas were identified. Meanwhile, being Muslims, they were issued work IDs to remain in Saudi Arabia. But the fate of the refugees are at stake, as Saudi Arabia has now refused to give jobs to stateless people. So what is the solution to this? As not to further complicate the socio-economic and environmental stability of this country, shouldn't it be Myanmar to give them citizenship and not otherwise put pressure on Bangladesh and its people? As the prospect of a repatriation was becoming dim, the government rightfully insisted that the present refugee camp was becoming overcrowded and a relocation was required to avoid further deforestation, fatalities due to landslides in the hilly terrain, spread of epidemics, deterioration of security situation due to drug smuggling, human trafficking, and conflicts instigated between rival groups amongst the refugees. As these major reasons were identified, the government was prompted to locate and execute the relocation with immediate effect. Despite protests and arguments by experts and rights groups, the government has successfully presented Bhashanchar as a site in which the refugees would live comfortably with adequate space. Anyone would find the concrete structure with shared kitchen and toilet arrangements, lighting and running water facilities as way better than those that the refugees put up with at the original mega camp. There was talk of fear of isolation and loneliness and less freedom of movement amongst the refugees. But refugee camps all over the world follow certain norms, and the inmates require to follow them too. It is a temporary home. One has to make the best of the situation, aided by all concerned. I will end now by stating we are Bangladeshis, and we have to be aware of one fact, that it was due to an en masse ethnic cleansing carried out in Myanmar that an exodus occurred which compelled the Rohingyas, Muslim ethnic community, to flee from their land and enter neighboring Bangladesh. But that is history now. Relocating the refugees is not the issue to point fingers at Bangladesh. Rohingya Muslims have a dream, their aims and claims. So it is time for Myanmar to act now. It is time to give back the Rohingyas their own rightful land by providing citizenship and security to reside in peace and harmony. The goal is now to work for their safe and honorable repatriation to the Rakhine state. Today in the morning, in the newspaper, you will see the Rohingya crisis. There's always a column in one or two newspapers. The Dhaka seeks active global support for the repatriation. That is my last word. Thank you all.
Thank you, Trustee Zafarullah, and especially for fitting this into your tight schedule. I know you have another engagement soon, right now. I am honored to move to our next presentation.
Dr. Imtiaz, could I interrupt you? I would like to leave now and take leave from everyone. And I will get back to you if I can in the evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and we look forward to it.
Thank you.
Um, I would like to turn, and I'm very honored to do so, to our chief guest, His Excellency, Mr. Robert Chatterton Dixon, and he's touching perhaps the key question of the day about return, about relief, and where do we draw the line? Your Excellency, please.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Shubho Shokal, Ami Ekane Ashti Pere Anondito. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for bringing me here to talk about this crucial issue. And I'd like to congratulate IUB for convening this conference and bringing together so many expert speakers. It's a particular delight for me because I've now been in Bangladesh for nearly 2 years as High Commissioner. And I think this issue, along with climate, is probably the single dossier on which I've spent most of my time. It is extraordinary what a multifaceted crisis this is, and how the British government's close involvement, as I'll set out in just a minute, on both relief and returns, means that on this issue more than any other, I'm constantly engaged, because for us in the UK, this is a critical issue. And it's very good to see so many people here, because it's clear that there's a very wide variety of people who need to be engaged with this problem. It needs government and policymakers, it needs the international community, it needs civil society, it means the humanitarian community. And I think it's great that this morning's event gives us the opportunity to come together and share experiences in a fora such as this. Because it's out of that sort of discussion that will come, we hope, sound and evidence-based policymaking, which will ensure that the Rohingyas are both looked after properly while they're here in Bangladesh, but also gives them the best possible opportunity of doing what we all want them to do, which is return safely and in a dignified and voluntary way to Myanmar. And it's very important in looking at civil society and the role that civil society plays, that there's a role in this for the Rohingya themselves. I have been to the refugee camps in Cox's Bazar on many occasions. I always try when I'm there to talk to the Rohingyas. It's very interesting to listen to the Rohingyas and hear what they want. The two things that they always say is, first of all, that they're very grateful to Bangladesh for the support that they've received since they arrived, whenever that was, usually in 2017, but sometimes earlier. So they're very grateful for that support, but also that they want to go home. They want to be back in Bangladesh. They want to be back in Myanmar. They are grateful for the support they've received, but this is not their home and they want to return to their homes. So I think it's very important that in looking at ways to take forward our discussion and our consideration of this crisis, we never forget to include the Rohingyas and Rohingya voices, and do everything that we can to make sure that the Rohingyas themselves have a voice. The title of this session is Relief and Return, the Crucial Balance. And I think the point is that it is a balance. It's not a binary choice. And I think we need to look at the two aspects together and look at ways in which we can play them off together and look at them in a holistic and coherent way. And of course, in doing so in Bangladesh, we have the enormous advantage that we are looking at a country with a very long experience through its own history of refugees. Millions of people, of course, fled from East Pakistan, then Bangladesh into India, and then they returned, and there was a successful process of reintegration. So there's a lot that we as the international community can learn from the Bangladeshi experience, both of being refugees, but also in handling a huge refugee influx through successive waves of Rohingyas who have been forced across the border. And I would just stress in all of this that we as the UK continue to be vocal advocates for voluntary, safe and dignified returns. That remains the key point for us. And it's obviously very good that there is some diplomatic activity taking place. Foreign Minister Momen frequently reminds us of the importance of this, but it was good that just last week saw the latest trilateral talks between Myanmar, Bangladesh and China. We may not expect very rapid results, but it is much better to be talking than not to be talking. And the preliminary accounts that came out of that meeting were, I think, slightly more positive than some of the accounts that we've had of previous rounds of those meetings. So that was good. Let's talk a little bit about relief and the conditions in the camps and the things that we can do together, because whatever happens on the diplomatic channels and in the trilateral talks and all the other things that are taking place, it's clear that this population is going to be here in Bangladesh for some time. Even if a process could be agreed for rapid returns, it would obviously take a long time to return the million or so people who are involved. So it's crucial that the Cox's Bazar humanitarian operation is sustained in order to provide for and protect the refugees and provide them with the best capabilities that they need to enable them to return. And I should just say a word in this about Bhasan Char, because obviously there has been a huge amount of focus here about the movement of some of the population to Bhasan Char Island. And we're very clear that there might well be a role in supporting part of the population for moving people to Bhasan Char. It is the government's sovereign right to put people in parts of the country where they can best be looked after. And that might well be Bhasan Char. But what we need in order to assess whether that is indeed the case is for the United Nations to be able to go to Bhasan Char, have a proper look and do two things. One is to do a proper technical assessment of the island. What has been done on the island looks very impressive. A huge amount of construction has been done. Walls are being constructed. There's a large settlement. There's all the facilities that are needed. But what we haven't been able to do yet is have the United Nations able to take a proper technical team there to look at at the quality of the construction and whether it will be safe to put tens of thousands, up to 100,000 people on a low-lying char in an area which frequently has cyclonic events. So we need the UN to be able to do that. We also need the UN to be able to do a proper protection mission to talk to the Rohingyas who have been on Bhasan Char since May, when they were very rightly and generously rescued by the government of Bangladesh in terrible conditions in the Bay of Bengal. But we need the UN as the key international enabler to do those visits, to talk to the Rohingyas already there, to assess the overall suitability of the project for receiving large numbers of people. And then when we have that United Nations assessment, then we, as the international community, the donors to the humanitarian effort and the government, can sit down together on a proper evidence base and talk about how Bhasan Char can be used as part of the overall effort to sustain refugees while they're here in Bangladesh. And it would be very good if we can have that conversation with the government in the near future. I am seeking at the moment, along with some of my diplomatic colleagues, a meeting with the Home Minister, who I think is probably the most directly responsible for this. And we are very keen that that meeting should take place soon. We are very closely involved because we, as the UK, have been the second largest contributor to the Cox's Bazar and Rohingya relief operation since 2017. We've contributed nearly £300 million sterling to that effort. We are the second international contributor behind the United States. And we think that in taking this humanitarian effort forward as we go well into the fourth year of this presence, we think there are things that could be done, or more of which could be done in order to provide the right conditions for the refugees. And we think there's a particular need now to focus on education and livelihoods for what we know is a population that is going to be in Cox's Bazar for at least the short to medium term, whatever happens on the highly desirable goal of returning people. Because there are three advantages to giving people education, giving the children and young people education and giving the adults livelihoods. The first is it reduces their dependence on humanitarian aid and increases their sense of dignity. The second is that it reduces the risk of refugees turning to criminality, which I absolutely see as an increasing problem in and around the camps. But it's a particular risk for people who are underoccupied. There's an old saying about an idle mind as the devil's playground, or the devil finding work for idle hands. And it is crucial when you have a large population of able-bodied people that they are given the opportunity to put their skills and their energies to good use. So that's the second reason why I think it would be a good thing if there can be more emphasis than there is at the moment on education and livelihoods. And the third is that, of course, what we all want is for the Rohingyas to return home as soon as possible to Myanmar. And people are more likely to be able to return, reintegrate, make a positive contribution in Myanmar if it has been possible for them to earn a living while in the camps here, but also in the case of the children and young people who are very evident as a presence when you go to the camps to learn the skills, have the education that would enable them to be productive citizens of Myanmar when they eventually return to Rakhine. What I would say is that I think it is remarkable as we go into the fourth year, as we enter into the fourth year of this crisis, how much international support there is for this. I mean, the world is not short, I have to say, of international humanitarian crises at the moment. There are terrible things happening, whether it's in Yemen particularly, but also in other places where there are great difficulties, the Sahel, the Horn of Africa. And I think it's good that the international community is continuing, despite these very wide range of international crises, and the huge pressure that's been put on finances and relief finances everywhere by the COVID pandemic. Nonetheless, this crisis still remains a very important one globally. And in October last year, we, along with the United States, the EU, and UNHCR, hosted an international conference which was able to raise £600 million for the continuing support for the international operation in Cox's Bazar, which I think is particularly good when you look at the scale of the global economic challenge from COVID, and as I said, the competition for international resources from other equally acute crises around the world. And that £600 million is a very strong down payment by the international community in the continuing support of the refugee population here. So I think it's very important that sometimes I think there's a sense that it's easy for people here to think that actually the international community has forgotten about the Rohingyas and has left Bangladesh to handle them on their own. And actually the raising of £600 million last October, I think, is a good sign that has not been the case. So we continue to be strong supporters of the operation in Cox's Bazar. We think there should be more focus in that operation on education and livelihoods. One thing that has been very good about Cox's Bazar is the fact that COVID, which we all thought a year ago as the COVID crisis erupted around the world, we thought that there might be a terrible COVID crisis among the very vulnerable population in Cox's Bazar, and that has not happened. We as the UK put £11 million into mitigating the impact of COVID among the refugee population and among the host community population in Cox's Bazar, in and around Cox's Bazar. And I'm very pleased that as a result of that effort, and also I think because of epidemiological and demographic factors that we don't completely understand but are clearly at play, there hasn't been a huge COVID crisis in the camps or in the immediately surrounding host communities, which doesn't at all mean that we should let our guard down, but does mean that we have played a part in preventing what could have been a huge additional factor in the crisis. So we've talked about the relief. On the returns, we are absolutely clear, as I said, as the UK, that it is right that the refugees should be enabled to return to Myanmar as soon as they can in conditions that are safe, dignified, and voluntary. This is a crisis that was caused in Myanmar, and the solution lies in Myanmar. And what we think is that when you look at it, you can actually see fairly clearly what the ingredients would be for a solution that would enable the refugees to return. The first is that it would be great to see de-escalation of the conflict in Rakhine State. Rakhine State has been an unstable part of Myanmar for many years, but there is clearly an interest right across the piece, whether it's on the part of the Myanmar government, the people living in Rakhine, or indeed some of the other countries internationally engaged in Rakhine, to de-escalate this conflict. Because if it continues, it's going to continue to be a source of instability in Myanmar and in the region more generally. So we think there's a very strong interest by everyone in de-escalating that conflict. And when you're looking at how to do that, then we're lucky because we have a blueprint effectively on the shelf that we can draw down and use. The Rakhine Advisory Commission in 2017 produced a report, a comprehensive document that addressed the root causes of the crisis. And it would be the implementation of the recommendations that the Rakhine Commission made provide all the basic framework, we think, for ensuring that return is both possible and sustainable for the Rohingyas. Very clearly for the Rohingyas, one of the problems that they have had is that while there are 136 recognized ethnicities in Myanmar, there is not at the moment recognition or citizenship for the refugees themselves, for the Rohingyas as a specific ethnic group. And it's very clear that a step that the newly forming government in National League for Democracy government in Myanmar could take, if it wanted to, would be to offer the Rohingyas citizenship as a way of guaranteeing that they would have the same rights as anyone else in Myanmar. And finally, it's very clear that accountability for the perpetrators of atrocities committed in Myanmar, particularly in August of 2017, but before then, will be a crucial part of giving the Rohingyas confidence in returning to Myanmar. And the International Court of Justice has applied provisional measures And seeing Myanmar adhere to those provisional measures would be a very good way for them to demonstrate confidence in accountability and in holding to account those who committed the atrocities which led to the departure of the Rohingyas in the first place. And I think there's a wider role for this, for Myanmar's partners. Myanmar has plenty of partners in the Indo-Pacific region. It has partners in ASEAN. And I think it's incumbent on everybody to recognize that regional stability could only benefit the wider things that we all want to do in the region, that its partners want to do, that Myanmar wants to do, can only benefit from a settlement of this very acute crisis. And it's worth remembering that there is a lot going on already in this space. It's just over a year since the Gambia brought its historic case against Myanmar to the International Court of Justice. And it was striking, I think, that Aung San Suu Kyi, the first state councillor, who isn't often seen on the international stage, went to The Hague to defend Myanmar. And in doing so, she acknowledged for the first time that members of the Tatmadaw, the Myanmar armed forces, had committed what amounted to war crimes. And that, of course, sets off a legal process which is now underway. We as the UK, we're what's called the pen holder, so we're the lead member of the Security Council on this issue, and we've used that role to continue to keep the crisis in Rakhine and the Rohingya crisis in the international spotlight, which I wouldn't pretend it's easy, because it's clear that there is not consensus among the permanent members of the Security Council, let alone among the wider membership of the Security Council, about this crisis. But the fact that we're not achieving quick results doesn't mean that we won't continue to make sure that this crisis remains firmly on the agenda of the Security Council. And we'll be working with some of the non-permanent members, particularly India, who of course is now a member, to try and make sure that we bring the widest range of allied opinion to bear on this. Evidence plays a crucial part in accountability, and since the start of the crisis, we've worked with partners to fund and promote the fact-finding mission for Myanmar and the independent investigative mechanism for Myanmar, which provide core documents and evidence for holding the people who committed the crimes to account, to preserve evidence and make sure that as the legal processes move forward, there will be the evidence on which proper trials can be based for the war crimes and atrocities that were committed. And bilaterally, now that we are no longer members of the European Union, we have the ability, for the first time in our recent history, to apply bilateral sanctions, to take our own sanctions regime rather than the slightly more slow-moving and cumbersome European sanctions regime. And the first round of sanctions that we applied last summer included the top two Myanmar generals who had been identified by the fact-finding mission as responsible for directing atrocities in Rakhine State. And that tells its own story about how appalled we were by what had happened in Rakhine in August of 2017. So a lot is happening. I wouldn't pretend that any of this is going to work quickly, but the point is evidence is being collected. The ICJ is working through, the International Court of Justice is working through its measures. The International Criminal Court is collecting evidence. The fact-finding mission and the independent investigative mission are making sure that the evidence is available. So you can see how the different elements are coming together, and with the right political will internationally, I think there is the real possibility of achieving progress, and at the very least keeping the government of Myanmar under continued pressure and providing continued political support to the government of Bangladesh as it continues to very generously with its international partners to host the refugees. Because I just end by reminding everyone that this crisis is bad for everyone involved. It's very bad for the Rohingyas. It's a tragedy for them that 600,000 people, 600,000 Rohingyas still in Myanmar have been deprived of their homes, families, and property. They've been herded into what effectively look like concentration camps from the outside, as well as the 850,000 who were driven across the border in 2017. So there is a crime, a series of crimes that have been committed against the Rohingya people, which to amount to a tragedy for them. The crisis is also very bad for Bangladesh. It places a huge burden on Bangladesh. The environmental, economic, and increasingly security and social impacts of hosting the refugee population have clearly had a massive impact, and the generosity with which the Bangladeshi government and people have stepped up to support the Rohingyas doesn't mean that it's not very much in Bangladesh's interest for this crisis to be resolved quickly. And so no one, I think, questions that the crisis is bad for the Rohingyas and bad for Bangladesh, but I would argue that it's also very bad for Myanmar, because I've been working on Myanmar in different ways in the in a diplomatic career of more than 30 years. And what we had all hoped in the first 20 years that I was in the Foreign Office, from 1990 to 2010, we had the hope that when Myanmar emerged from generations of military misrule, it would take its place as an increasingly prosperous and democratic member of the international community. And we had great hopes when Aung San Suu Kyi was able to form or play a major part in forming the first government, when we saw the Tatmadaw step back from their iron grip on that society. And it's been a huge disappointment to everyone that we have seen the Myanmar government in its new form nonetheless commit these deeply appalling racist campaigns of ethnic cleansing against the Rohingyas. And I think if Myanmar is going to take its place as a fully fledged member of the community of nations, then it cannot do that while this crisis remains unresolved. So I think a resolution to the crisis which enables the Rohingyas to return is very much in the interests of Myanmar itself. And finally, I think it's hugely in the interests of the Indo-Pacific region more generally, and I would include in that ASEAN and Myanmar's partners in that organization. Because what we're all thinking about is economic development, climate, environmental, trying to improve the way, trying to combine economic growth with environmental protection. Connectivity is obviously an important part of that. There are all sorts of links that can be developed between Myanmar, India, Bangladesh, Thailand. All of these things will remain much more difficult while we are in a situation where there are unresolved atrocities that have been committed against the Rohingyas. Now, of course, there is a political dimension for Myanmar, as I said already. So wherever one sits, I think it's clear that voluntary, safe and dignified return for the Rohingyas has to be the right answer. And in the meantime, it's crucial that we as the international community continue to work with the extraordinarily capable and generous government of Bangladesh in making sure that the refugees are supported in a way that will enable them to return as soon as that is politically possible. So thank you very much indeed for having me here today. I think it's always worth restating. Some of these positions you'll have heard before, but it's always worth restating them because they are a major commitment for us in the UK. Our government remains very committed. We're having very encouraging, I think, early signs of where the US government, the new Biden administration, may also be placed on this crucial crisis. And I look forward to working with you and hearing the discussion during today's event. Thank you very much. Dhanabat.
Thank you ever so much, British High Commissioner to Bangladesh, His Excellency Robert Dixon. We are very interested in the climate concerns that you have expressed, and we hope that we can have greater exchanges between the British High Commission and Independent University in Bangladesh. We go next to our special guest, Dr. Georgi Zhigori. Welcome aboard. It's all yours.
Thank you very much, sir. I hope the audio is okay and I'm coming across clearly and audibly. First and foremost, dear Excellencies, colleagues, friends, Shobo Shakal, Assalamu alaikum. It is great to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation, and congratulations to the organizers for creating a discussion and a forum on this very important topic at this very important juncture. So thanks again to the IUB and everyone for the initiative. Today I will briefly speak on the security considerations, developments and potential way forward in Cox's Bazar and specifically the Rohingya camps, and what we as the humanitarian community, but also as the wider development and diplomatic community in Bangladesh should be working on, considering and analyzing for the benefit of both the host communities in the district and of course the Rohingya refugees. So first of all, and I never get tired of saying this, it's important to recognize the incredibly generous gesture and continuous support that Bangladesh has provided and continues to provide to the refugees. It is quite extraordinary, especially in the context of more restrictive policies around the world and more restrictive measures against displaced populations that are taking place in many areas. So that is something that we should never forget, and something that should continue to be appreciated. Now, as we all know, the Rohingya crisis did not start in 2017. There is a fairly long history, depending on how far back you're supposed to go, depending which academic and historian you read. But in terms of the specific displacement waves, this is the third one in Bangladesh, and Rohingyas have, or some of them have already returned. There is, in fact, this very famous picture in a story that has been making its way on social media and other outlets in 2018 about a woman who's been displaced 3 times, who is now in Cox's Bazar in Kutupalong, who was displaced in late 70s, late 70s, late 90s, and now. So that, in terms of how that relates to security and the developing security situation. So a number of things to keep in mind, first of all. So as we know, especially Teknaf, especially southern Cox's Bazar, has had its security challenges that predate the Rohingyas and in some ways are not related to Rohingyas. And that's not just the Yaba trade, there's a smuggling trade in place and trafficking networks and rings that are quite active there. Now, when you add 900,000 displaced population on top of that precarious situation, naturally that compounds and makes the safety and security dimension more complex. So first of all, when we speak about security in the camps, it's first question we have to ask is security for who and safety for who. There are security issues within the camp that relate specifically to the relations between Rohingya refugees themselves. Some of them to do with safety and generally invisible things that we would, as UN, categorize under protection, things like gender-based violence, things like the safety of women, or just basically the ability to walk around at night or use the latrine safely. A lot of extortion within the camps. This is and naturally some violence as well. And that's Rohingyas dealing with different groups within the Rohingya communities dealing with each other. There's an additional dimension of different populations. It is, some of them are business related at least, but the older population and the newly displaced population. So if you look at the what we call the RC, the Kutupalong registered camp, which begins in the early 90s, and then the 2017 displaced population, there are even some tensions between those. So there's a lot of dynamics and underwater currents to keep in mind. So that's within the Rohingya population. Then there are issues between the host communities, specifically in Ukia and Teknaf, and the newly arrived refugees. And that's to do with first of all competition for resources. We've all read the reports. We know there's a lot of I don't want to use the word conflict, but let's say disagreement, and that sometimes turns to violence in terms of starting from small things like even collecting firewood on somebody's land to intermarriages that are taking place against the will of some of the elders or parents, and then a direct competition for resources in terms of livelihoods. And then there are some criminal elements that come into play as well. And then the third element, of course, is the already established criminal networks that are predominantly to do with the Yaba trade that predate the Rohingyas, with some involvement of Rohingyas, but actually have been going on for a long time. And there is very serious violence and crime associated with that. If you read the local Cox's Bazar news, or every day, literally every day, you will see some gang-related violence incidents being reported. So when we speak about solutions to those problems from a humanitarian perspective, we have to keep all these analyses in mind to make sure that our solutions are fit for purpose and addressing the problems that exist, and are addressing so effectively and addressing so in a sustainable way. Now, that is easier said than done. First of all, because security in the camps is not, or rather maintaining and ensuring safety and security in the camps is not the job of the UN or the NGOs. It is very much not only the role of the law enforcement. It is actually the duty of the law enforcement according to international law and according, of course, to the government procedures in place. This is not unique to Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh in any way, but what we've been seeing over the past, 3.5 years now is an increased securitization narrative. Now, that is not a problem in itself. Securitization is neither good nor bad. It depends on whether it is an adequate response to the problems that are emerging, and are these problems being addressed by ensuring stronger law enforcement response. Now, if you don't have safety and security in the camps, it's very difficult to do humanitarian operations. So it is absolutely in the interest of everyone on the ground to make sure that there is an enabling environment for humanitarian aid to be implemented, for dialogue to continue, and in fact for repatriation to take place, because let's also remember the narrative being developed across the border in Myanmar that is trying to portray Rohingyas as criminals. So they jump on any unrest as a propaganda opportunity to say, oh, you see, there is an unruly behavior and there's a lot of socially unfriendly elements there that we don't want to import. So it is definitely in the interest of all. However, when we look at things like fencing, when we can debate about the effectiveness and appropriateness of such measures. Now, one of the very welcome developments has been a bigger and longer presence of APBN and police. So one thing that we've been working with the government and promoting, and we hope that this will continue and grow, is the community-based approach, where the deployed police develop relationship with the elders, with the community representatives, and are able to police better. There's also a joint community safety initiative that we're undertaking with UNHCR and UNDP that looks at specifically of what we can do to improve not only the response mechanism, but also prevention of potential outbursts of violence, specifically also looking at the border areas between the camp and the host communities. So the one particular issue that I would like to highlight is that there is, and that tends to be, this is part of a global narrative that some, I think, can trace back to the Marshall Plan and the post Second World War thinking within the academia, and that goes for the development and humanitarian realms alike, that sees injection of cash and creation of jobs and income as a solution. Now, I don't want to disparage or downplay the importance of livelihoods. They're absolutely vital pillar and component of the security programming or security improvement strategy for Cox's Bazar. I know that for Rohingyas there are restrictions on livelihoods, but there are no restrictions on work with host communities and development activities with them, and that is happening and should continue and expand. And hopefully the Cox's Bazar development plan will take this into account as well. And whatever we can do, the High Commission mentioned education, training, volunteering opportunities within the parameters that set for us by the government, whatever we can do to support the Rohingyas that can and should be done, but that should not be the exclusive focus, meaning that livelihoods alone will not resolve the security situation. So another area that I think we do need more focus on is the creation of, I don't like to use the word conflict, but traditionally this is called conflict resolution mechanisms. In this case, let's say dispute resolution mechanisms between, within the camps, and then between the host communities and the refugees. There are different forms of that sporadically happening in some places. For Teknaf, where we have host communities and refugees living closer together in places like Shamlapur and Nayapara, there already are some forms of that, like the para development committees and the welfare committees. But this has to be more systematic with the active engagement of the government, specifically both the police and the army. This is very important. And then finally, what I'd like to put particular emphasis on is information and the way information travels in Cox's Bazar. Again, I don't want to use the word hate speech because it is very vague and there's a lot of debate about what that actually means, but we can safely speak about misinformation and specifically social media that takes misinformation and spreads it at an incredible speed. So by the time the correction takes place, it is already too late and there is an emotional response taking place. And there is a lot of misinformation taking place about what's happening inside the camps, what's happening around the camps, and specifically to do with the image of refugees. Now, let's keep in mind, we're working in a context where the public opinion is shifting in Cox's Bazar. And that's normal, that's not unique. As time goes by, and if there is no light at the end of the tunnel, the host communities generally become less and less generous. In the beginning, we saw a lot of generosity and sympathy. However, if there is a pressure on resources and there are no solutions and support, or at least not to an adequate level as perceived by them, provided the public perception will worsen. This is we've seen this around the world, and this is well documented phenomena. So we need to do more work together with the government, together with the local authorities and civil society on, we cannot stop information, but at least how we can counter and how we can also show the good things that have been happening in Cox's Bazar, not just because of the investment of the international community, but also because of the work of the local authorities and of course of refugees themselves. So these are the things that I would like to put on the table that I hope we can also get some academic support in terms of quantifying the impact. So the three things to sum up that I'm proposing where we need more funding, more attention, and more focus. First of all, is the dispute resolution mechanism to be put in place. Secondly, information management and public perception management and how we proceed with that. And then finally, the importance of keeping security on top of the agenda, because it is too often, I think, viewed as exclusively role of the government and specifically through a law enforcement lens. But as international humanitarian community, we have a very important role to play in this area to support and improve the situation wherever we can. And we have many good examples and lessons learned where we have seen the situation improve. So in many ways, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We have to keep our hand on the pulse. We have to know exactly what is happening to the extent possible, and then address those problems as they arise. But again, as the High Commissioner mentioned, all of these things that I'm saying are short-term solutions. The only long-term solution there is the return of refugees to their homeland. Thank you very much indeed, and I wish everyone a productive and a rich discussion.
Georgie, for your presentation, but through you also to the organization you represent and the people working with you on this. A tremendous job, and thank you again. We move to our third special guest, and this will be the Assistant Representative Operations of the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, Ms. Fumiko Kashiwa, and please excuse me if the pronunciation was not perfect. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and your pronunciation was perfect. I hope the audio is working well, and I hope everybody could hear me. Okay, thank you very much for nodding also to confirm. Thank you very much first for the introduction again. Once again, good morning to all. It's been an honor for me to be able to speak at this event alongside such a distinguished speakers who have the great expertise on the subject. I've been listening very carefully the remarks already by previous speakers, which have been really already inspirational and inspiring. And this event is really becoming a learning opportunity for me who just recently arrived in Bangladesh. And some of the points that already previous speakers have touched upon also will come into my speech. And that to me is also reconfirming that there is a continued collective interest and collective efforts to address the current Rohingya situation and look for the sustainable solutions. So this morning session is about the big picture. And if I may, I would like to first start with the UNHCR, which is the UN Refugee Agency's big picture, and how it intersects with the Rohingya situation and also Bangladesh. So UNHCR works in 120 countries across the world, and we work to provide protection, assistance, and try to find the solutions for refugee, asylum seekers, stateless people, and all those who are forced to flee. And this includes Rohingyas in Bangladesh, Myanmar, and across the region. So our work has long history in the sub-region and with Bangladesh, as some of the speakers have also mentioned. After the persecution and violence that forced millions of Bangladesh people to flee to India in 1970s, UNHCR worked with Bangladesh refugees in India and worked with them when they returned to a new independent Bangladesh. These are the historical ties that have bound UNHCR to the government and the people of Bangladesh. And as the speakers mentioned, also the Bangladesh experiences in the refugee response and refugee support is tremendous. So nearly 50 years on, today we found ourselves again playing a principal role in the refugee response, together with IOM and UN Resident Coordinator and under the leadership of the government of Bangladesh. This especially is following the latest influx of some 740,000 Rohingya refugees who fled from Myanmar to Bangladesh in 2017. This latest influx was the largest in the region since 1971. The speed and scale of the influx made it the world's fastest growing refugee crisis and a major humanitarian emergency in 2017. The government of Bangladesh demonstrated a profound humanitarian commitment to Rohingya refugees, keeping the border open and offering safety and shelters to the fleeing families. We were also all very moved by the hospitality, solidarity, and generosity shown by Bangladesh people towards the refugees, as mentioned also by the previous speakers. So under the leadership of the government, local authorities, local charities, civil societies, volunteers, NGO, and the UN, we all work together to respond to the needs of refugees, providing them with the basic shelters, food, and other humanitarian assistance. We work together also to bring order to a rather quite chaotic situation that we faced in the initial stages of the influx. And since then, the joint efforts have continued to implement a comprehensive multi-sectorial response to address the essential needs of refugees, but as well as to the Bangladesh communities who have been generously hosting refugees. But as my colleagues have also mentioned, when we talk about the big picture, we cannot not to forget that the Rohingya refugee situation did not start in 2017. Rohingya people have sought safety and refuge in Bangladesh in successive waves, as we all know. In the late 70s, we saw more than 200,000 Rohingya people fleeing Myanmar to Bangladesh. Many soon have returned since. In the early 1990s, some 250,000 Rohingyas again fled to Bangladesh, most of whom have returned. And for smaller group, except for the small group of some 34,000 people who still live in a two registers camp in Cox's Bazar. And 2016, some 65,000 fled Myanmar, seeking safety in Bangladesh. So the cyclical waves of violence, persecution, and persistent discrimination has led to the second wave of forced displacement of Rohingyas, people from Myanmar, and culminating in the largest movement ever seen in 2017. So against this background, as colleagues also reinforced, it's clear that ultimately the solution to the plight of the Rohingya lies in Myanmar and in addressing root causes of their displacement. We must work continue together to find a truly sustainable solution to this crisis, and so that refugee people never feel compelled to flee and to seek protection and safety in Bangladesh or elsewhere. In the given context, the focus of the sustainable solution that we continue working towards is a safe, voluntary, dignified, and sustainable return of the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh to Myanmar. And this is what many Rohingya refugees tell us that they want for their future, and thus remains a shared priority for UNHCR and also the government of Bangladesh. And we remain deeply committed to this objective. We therefore continue to, of course, encourage and support Myanmar to create the conditions conducive for return. Together with UNDP, UNHCR also continues to implement projects that aim at promoting social cohesion, undertaking consultations, and also addressing the needs of affected communities in the Rakhine State in Myanmar. UNHCR also continues to encourage that the refugees are consulted as part of the repatriation discussion and the process, including also the resumption and possible expansion of dialogue between the Myanmar authorities and the refugees. We believe this will be crucial for its success and sustainability of this process. I want to also touch upon, while not losing the sight of this objective, repatriation may still take some time. And the big picture that we also need to speak about is the situation of the nearly 900,000 refugees who remain in the camps in the Cox's Bazar. Given the scale of the hardship and the trauma that they have suffered, it is incumbent on all of us to support them to retain a clear vision for their futures, as well as live in a safe environment until return is possible. And for this reason, we really believe that we need to continue to ensure a well-coordinated, comprehensive, and well-funded humanitarian response in Cox's Bazar. And this means addressing the continuing humanitarian and protection needs of refugees, as well as to providing support to affected Bangladesh community who are generously hosting the refugees. And we hope to soon finalize the joint response plan for the Rohingya humanitarian crisis for 2021, which will set out a more comprehensive plan for this year. An aspect of this plan will also help us to keep the big picture and help to prepare refugees for their sustainable return to Myanmar when they decided to do so. This includes, as the High Commissioner also mentioned, ensuring Rohingyas have the decent education, particularly through the rollout of the Myanmar curriculum, as well as building skills that will be relevant for their future and for their integration when they are able to return to Myanmar. We are immensely grateful for the government's support in this area. At the same time, we need to continue our collective effort to provide support to the Bangladesh communities to offset some of the effects of the hosting refugees. It is worth noting that significant support has been also provided to the Cox's Bazar district from development actors, and this effort must continue to garner and sustain the support until solution is secured. As I think some other speakers also mentioned, the Bangladesh did not ask for this crisis, and its effect on the Bangladesh host communities must be properly addressed and mitigated. We are also, I think my previous speaker spoke about in security, we also recognize that security and the protection environment in the camp has been deteriorated, and particularly and possibly since the onset of the pandemic, and subsequent reduction of certain services and activities as a part of the mitigation measures. Looking at the big picture, as colleague mentioned, we must continue to try and ensure the safe and secure environment in the camps, and also for the Bangladesh people living nearby. It is in our common interest to ensure the people are safe, people are not idle, and people are with the productive outlets to spend their time. And this relation that we also believe that the continuation of engagement of the Rohingya refugees and supporting the Rohingya volunteer program, which underpin our works in the camp, will be critical. Rohingya volunteers also play key roles in supporting the disaster response, supporting maintaining the camps, supporting delivery of the assistance, including healthcare in the camps. And this is particularly important in the context of the COVID pandemic as well. This leads me to my last point, that we cannot also become complicit with the COVID-19 response. The pandemic remains the key part of the big picture, as we have seen in other parts of the world, how the evolution of the disease can be unpredictable. Since the onset of the pandemic, the humanitarian community has supported the government to enhance preparedness and response capacities. We work intensively to increase testing capacity, conduct extensive training for health workers and refugee volunteers, expanded hygiene awareness, water sanitation activities, among others. We also supported the establishment of the COVID hospitals and expanded ICU capacity in Cox's Bazar for Rohingya refugees and the Bangladesh people alike. To date, we have managed to contain the COVID situation and avoid a major catastrophe in the camps and communities around them. We are committed to continue supporting the government-led COVID response for the well-being of the Bangladesh and the refugee community, and committed to continue supporting the inclusive socioeconomic recovery from the impact of the COVID situation in the Cox's Bazar district. So just as a conclusion in a summary, it is for us all within the international community and others to continue encouraging, supporting Myanmar to address the root causes of displacement so that the Rohingyas are never feel compelled to flee again. This would help create the conditions conducive for return, which would allow refugees in Bangladesh to return in a safe and sustainable manner. In the meantime, and while we seek for this solution, we believe we must continue to ensure Rohingya can have a decent life and camps stay productive and safe, and to ensure that they have opportunity to learn, grow, and retain a vision for their future. We must continue to provide comprehensive support to the host communities, and we also continue to work to contain against the COVID virus. And this is how we see the blueprint for the big picture. And as the last remark, I just also would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge and appreciate the value of the work done by many of the participants and speakers of today's event for and with the Rohingya people. And I also really wish to recognize and stress the importance to acknowledge the strengths and the capacity of Rohingya refugees, and also the generosity that they demonstrated by the Bangladesh host communities. I believe this has been and this will continue to be the backbone of all of our work here. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity again. And it is really inspiring and encouraging to hear also the remarks from all other speakers. And I really look forward to listening more and to the event of today. Thank you very much.
Our gratitude, Assistance Representative, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Ms. Fumiko Kashiwa. Thank you so much. And could you also express our gratitude to your colleagues and your institution for all that you're doing to help us through this crisis.
Thank you very much.
We move to our next guest, and he is our discussant, the ever probing, almost my namesake in Dhaka University, Professor Imtiaz Ahmed. Please.
Thank you, Dr. Imtiaz Hussain, or I would say rather Imtiaz Bhai. Thank you very much. Friends, dignitaries, colleagues, and I can see a number of them sitting there. Good morning to all of you. And if you're outside Bangladesh and watching this webinar, again, good earth to all of you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity uh, to speak. I never got the papers of the three speakers, but I heard them, line by line. So what I will do, I'll try to pick up some of their points and try to say my views on this issue. Before I go to each of the three speakers, let me flag 4 points just to give you my understanding of the things. The first point is good that we are discussing Rohingyas in Bangladesh, but the gaze ought to be Myanmar. This is very important. The gaze should not shift from Myanmar. There should be equal number of papers on Myanmar as to what will happen after the election or what is happening after the election, who are the perpetrators, what is the ground reality. I understand people would say that it's difficult to do research on Myanmar, but then there are a lot of stuff coming up, even I would say in trying to deconstruct some of the media that is coming from Myanmar would help actually to understand the psyche. Otherwise, we are not going to go far in resolving the issue. So the Myanmar should be the gaze. If Myanmar is a 70% of the gaze, 30% I can understand can be Bangladesh. And this is despite the fact whether Bangladesh is keeping 1.1 million refugees or not. And this is, as I say, it is particularly important now that Myanmar already has an election, and they made it very clear that after the election they will sit down, and we saw already one particular meeting. Number two, this should be, I think, another key decision that we all ought to make, that whenever we have a conference on the Rohingyas, please keep some Rohingya speakers as key speakers. It's very important to listen to the Rohingya voice, and it doesn't matter whether they are brought from the Rohingya camps. There are Rohingya extraordinary leaders now around the globe, and since it's a webinar come physical presence, it could have been done. They're extraordinary diaspora Rohingya activists, which is very important. And I say this because I think it's time for everyone to actually help build the civilian leadership. We are talking about repatriation and repatriation. I think what is important is to have a civilian Rohingya leadership. And this, I think, the international organizations ought to help to the extent that in other areas that they have helped in other situations. And since we have High Commissioner Robert here, His Excellency, I would definitely request that UK can play a very important role, given the fact that a lot of Rohingya diaspora in UK who are very active. So Rohingya civilian leadership is very important, because it is the Rohingyas who will bargain and sit with the Myanmar government. Bangladesh is not going to, we have no problems with Myanmar. There's no territorial issues. Historically, we have been living with them for thousands of years. We still trade with them. Still, people go and visit Myanmar. So it's a problem with Myanmar government and Rohingyas. So if there is a dialogue, it's Rohingya ought to sit down with Myanmar government. Now, we need to form the leadership. Otherwise, what will happen? they will fall back to ARSA, whatever the ARSA is. So I think it's important that we invest on the Rohingyas. The third thing is since Rohingya identity has been recognized now by the ICJ in the provisional verdict, and I'm sure all of you are familiar with that. Not to mention that Aung San Suu Kyi herself never pointed out that they were illegal migrants or Bengalis, as the popular jargon goes in Myanmar. The concept that she mentioned was Arakanese Muslims. But anyway, but since ICJ now, at the international body, the global body with judges, without having a dissenting note, and we had a Myanmar judge as well, including a judge from China, India, and other places. So this ought to be flagged everywhere, very in a key point, particularly when discussing with Myanmar. That look, and this the international community ought to do, that if you want to talk about the Rohingyas, you must use the Rohingyas as a concept. You can't do that because the ICJ has already recognize the concept. Now you can't, given the fact that you are a member of the ICJ, you just can't say that we don't abide by it. Or if you don't, then you should say that clearly. Uh, and the last one is the Rohingyas in the Bhashan Chor. Please keep note of it. The idea is to put only 1 lakh ultimately, well, 900,000, but we have 10 more lakhs, 10 more lakhs in Cox's Bazar. So the very fact that we discuss Bhashan Chor, I get surprised because in 71, and I'm a child of 71, and I left my parents. I went to Agartala, as a, they will say, a child soldier. Literally slept on the pavement. Nobody questioned the Indian government when they shifted refugees from different places. So I find it quite extraordinary when we are not focusing on the 10 lakh, which is still there, and we are focusing more on 900,000 when it will come. And moreover, anybody knows that infrastructure that has been built is much better than where they are. If it was bad, it was just open field, I could have understood. So these are the 4 general points, but let me go into some of the points that His Excellency Robert Dixon was making. Um, on the issue of, I think Robert has rightly pointed out about relief and return, and UK is doing extraordinary job on that. But I think our understanding would be that UK should also, be more attentive to justice, as much as Canada and Netherlands are. And this is the point that I want to make. And I say this because some if you look at some of the statements coming out from UK Trade Department, where they will continue with the GSP even after Brexit, and the line is that we are not going from human rights, from trade preferences because of human violations. UK will remain with Myanmar. Then some of the very good thoughts that Robert put becomes questionable. Are we then having different opinions in the UK government or not? Number second is it's not only 1971 Bangladesh experience. Please keep in mind, Rohingyas returned twice. So those who say that people hardly return, refugees don't return, in the 70s and the 90s, both of the time they returned. Well, a little bit of were left out. The residual refugees in the first case were 10,000. Bangladesh agreed to keep the 10,000 refugees. Then later on, we did not, which is 30,000 now, I think, in UNHCR camp, which we did not agree to, melt with the Bangladesh population, and they remained. So return took place twice. It's not that return has not taken place. So this is in a different kind of a situation than in other circumstances where they say that you need extraordinary things to happen for the return to take place. But in the case of Bangladesh, Myanmar government did take them twice. The third issue, I think Robert has rightly pointed on the trilateral agreement, trilateral kind of meeting that is now taking place, Bangladesh, China, and Myanmar. But I always thought on this that why not UK? Why not other countries equally? Bring in trilateral. What is stopping them to have trilateral discussion or multilateral discussion, not trilateral? There can be multilateral. Why doesn't UK hold, an international conference, bring different stakeholders, including Myanmar? Given the fact that the UK, after all, was the former colonial power in Myanmar, and given the fact that UK has special relationship with Aung San Suu Kyi, so this has surprised me that why trilateral meetings are always limited to Bangladesh, China, and Myanmar. I think there should be more participation of the international community. Very quickly on Georgie's, very detailed presentations. I enjoyed listening to him. Couple of things, I guess 2 or 3 things I want to highlight. Um, since we map violence, Bangladesh, Dhaka University, the Center for Genocide Studies, we map violence in the camps, and you can yourself get into the website and look into the what we call the figures and all. We need to keep in mind that it's a bigger population than Bhutan. Bhutan is less than 800,000. We have here 1.1 million people. And to say that there is no violence in Bhutan, that would be surprising. So yes, there will be violence. I think humans cannot live without some form of violence. Now, whether the violence is beyond acceptability, since we record violence day to day, every day since 2017, we have been, mapping the violence in the Rohingya camps. I will say it's much more peaceful than New York or Chicago or different cities or Detroit, and I have the figures to back that up. Uh, I think what is needed here, and this I have to emphasize very clearly. Sometimes, because we are so much positivist in our methodology, we try to look into something, something that is odd. Let's put it. Violence definitely is odd, but we don't see why in some areas there is less violence. If you look at the entire Cox's Bazar area, you'll be surprised because I have the figures. In some of the camps, the violence is so less. Then you have to question why so less violence. What is there? What is it? Civilizational? Is it link? Is it resilience? Why is there so less violence? And this brings me to the third point. The Rohingyas have been living, the irregular or unregistered Rohingyas have been living there for quite some time. Over 300,000 have been living since 1990s, I would say. Now, if you look at the history of that, you are not going to get any serious violence. 300,000, that's a big number. That's not a small number. You know, 300,000 Rohingyas, you are not going to get a serious conflict with the locals, no riot. The kind of riot we saw in New York or Stuttgart during the pandemic, nothing of that kind. Now the question is why it is that? Why we don't have, they have been living since 1990, 300,000 of them. Forget the second 700,000 back, the earlier 300,000, and not to mention over 30,000 in UNHCR camps. No serious riot, no serious violence. How is it possible? That needs to be researched, and I think it is very important to do that because somehow, as I say, because the whole positivist methodology allows you to look into violence and not the peace. And this is the dialectic that I think is required. Refugee situation, and I've been working on refugees for years. Believe it or not, mythology is very important. I ended up writing a small book on the method, actually, keeping the Rohingyas and other kinds of violent extremism in my mind, and it's called Matters, and we use micro narratives, the life stories, mainly because the positivist framework doesn't really work with number and figures, really doesn't make sense as to what are the things that is happening there. Finally, I also enjoyed listening to Miss Fumiko Kashiwa, and this brings me to her presentation on COVID-19. I think this is an important one she flagged. This is absolutely requires serious research. How is it possible? Yes, people will say, well, the strains were different, where, maybe the weather, maybe they are, what your vitamin D they have, whatever it is. But the fact remains that so far, yes, it can be different, and I will agree with her. We should not be complacent, and that is precisely the reason why Bhashan Chor, a kind of infrastructure that has been built in Bhashan Chor, is required. I've talked even earlier that Bhashan Chor should be transformed, even if when the Rohingyas go back, should be made into a medical kind of a center, so that in the future, when the pandemic will happen, and pandemic will happen, virus will mutate. This is not something, it has nothing to do with the climate change or our flights. During the Spanish flu, there were no commercial airline, but look at the Spanish flu, or it has different names, and in Spain it used to call French flu, whatever they have, or the Bolshevik flu. Yeah, during that time, there were no commercial airlines, but it spread throughout the world and killed millions of people. So pandemic, the virus will mutate. Anybody have little knowledge on virus would know that virus will mutate, and it doesn't mutate in one place, it mutates in several places and in different form. So and I agree with Fumiko that COVID-19 gives us an opportunity as to why there is so less of casualty, so less of infection, but that should not keep us complacent, because you never know, it can mutate in one form tomorrow, and make things very difficult. And that brings me to the last to the issue of the final chord, Bhashan Chord, that Bhashan Chord could be the kind of infrastructure that has been built, could be made good use of if situations really gets bad in Cox's Bazar, though some COVID hospital has been made. So I see positively, and I was quite surprised that the UN Secretary General did not congratulate Bangladesh on the Bhashan Chor infrastructure. I was pretty surprised. I'm sure someday it will come, because it is for a country like Bangladesh to do something of that kind, and do it wholeheartedly, given the fact that Bangladeshis also don't live so comfortably. To create infrastructure of that kind, I think there should have been more congratulatory notes, rather than emphasizing on the issue of assessment and all. I think we sometimes we underestimate the Bengali mind. The Bengali mind is a very old mind. It's civilizationally, we are very old civilizationally. You can trace us back to 6th century BC. So there should be some respectability on that. So yes, I understand assessment would be required, but at the same time, the kind of infrastructure that has been done, and the people who went there, none of them were taken forcibly. So those are the things should be appreciated, and I believe one day appreciation will come. But I was quite surprised, given the fact it's only 900,000 they want to shift. It's not like 10 lakhs, are not that 1.1 million will be shifted. Let's focus on 10 lakhs, and let's focus on Myanmar. I'm pretty sure. And very last point. This is a different refugee situation this time, and it doesn't match the 70s and the 90s, mainly because this time there is credible evidence that a genocide has been committed. This is important. ICJ provisional verdict has really pointed, and that's precisely the reason why they are going for the full assessment of the thing. Otherwise, they would have just stopped it. And that makes that clearly tells you that it's a genocidal kind of a regime. And I'm quite surprised the international community has not done the way it ought to. And it's important that Myanmar should feel the pressure. And here I think the pressure ought to be built also on India and Japan. These two countries are actually supporting Myanmar in a way which is helping China as well. The moment India and Japan decouples from Myanmar, I believe China cannot, bear the pressure alone. So these are some of the countries we can work very closely, and I'm sure UK has extraordinary relationship with both India and Japan. If they can also start working on those lines, I believe we can resolve the issue that we have and bring justice to the Rohingyas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Imtiaz. I think you caught us napping by not having any Rohingya representatives here today. It's something you're big on, and our common colleague, Dr. Meghna, is also very big on that, and something we will work on. We are really lucky and would like to, since we have our honored guests with us and our esteemed peers, if you could spare a few minutes for some questions and comments. I think some of you might have some. And before I begin, though, it would not be right of me if I did not introduce my collaborators on this project. And could I request Dr. Raju, he's the head of the Media and Communications Department here, to please show yourself. And likewise, can I also request lecturer Sharmeen Ahmed, who is the head of the Social Sciences and Humanities Department, and our younger faculty who have really propped up this whole conference. Could I request lecturer Marjuk, senior lecturer Jessica, and Dr. Marufa, please show yourself. Thank you all so much. Let's open up for questions and comments, and let's see how far we can go with that. We have about 15, 20 minutes for that. Please.
Thank you, sir. We have some questions from the online platform that we are doing a Facebook Live, and we are holding it on the YouTube channel as well. So first of all, the first question is towards the Excellency. So it's the question about local Bengali community are facing huge backlash and growing compassion fatigue due to the Rohingya infusion at Cox's Bazar. How it could be balanced? I think we can go by one question.
Thank you. I mean, it's an extremely good and important question. I mean, I can see that having 1 million Rohingya refugees moving into a host community of 350,000 is a huge challenge. It's obviously a part of the country, as was discussed earlier, which had some challenges anyway. What we're trying to do on our humanitarian effort is to make sure that we bear the needs of the host community in mind throughout our programming. And I have visited host community projects that are going on in the host community that are designed to address their well-being as well as that of the Rohingyas. And I think it's very important that we make sure that this is recognized in the sort of way that we present these things publicly, because as I say, you know, clearly the Rohingya community is a big burden, put bluntly, for the host community, and we need to make sure that the benefits to the host community from the international presence and from donor projects are recognized as well, because we are doing a lot of work in the host communities, but it's key that is recognized. So we're working on that.
Thank you very much. The next question is about an open floor for all the discussants. what is the role of online media or Facebook in initiating communal violence in Myanmar against the Rohingyas? What role can social media or Facebook play a role against the communal violence in Myanmar in case of Rohingya refugee crisis? You want to answer it?
Can you check if Dr. George is still here? Even even Imtiaz, Dr. Imtiaz, you're also open for questions and
Oh,
comments.
okay. Sure. What's the question, please? Sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, so it's about what role can social media or Facebook play against the communal violence in Myanmar, especially in case of Rohingya refugee crisis?
Communal violence in Myanmar. Okay, I think no, social media is everybody has in his or her pocket. So nowadays with the social media, you don't need an editor, you don't need to be a fantastic writer. You can be a cartoonist, you can be a documentary filmmaker. Of course, you can write blogs and emphasize the point and circulate around the world the kind of justice that is required, the kind of issues that you think ought to be brought in, because silence here is actually helping the Myanmar military. And as I say, that it's a different situation altogether, mainly because you have a genocide. Now, when any it doesn't matter whether it's Myanmar or whether it's Kampuchea or the Houthis or the Tutsi, doesn't matter. When a genocide is formed, it becomes an international issue by definition. Please look into the charter, of the act of genocide and of the convention, sorry, of the convention of genocide, and you will see that the moment a country does a genocide, it becomes an international issue. Since it's an international issue, it's a human issue. And so for that matter, I think the more you use the social media, because that's what it is, that's the future, it's not the past. Hardly people read the print media now. And the print media has also gone what you call online. So it is important that you make your presence. Otherwise, the other side will make their presence. And we have seen in the context of violent extremism how Al Qaeda and ISIS and other fundamentalist group, including the right wing white supremacists, have made extraordinary use of the social media. So if you remain silent, then I'm afraid it will be made use of by people where you are going to have tough time.
Thank you. I think it's time we can open the floor towards the participants we have here in person. So anyone who wants to ask a question, please raise your hand and start your question, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rayan. I just would like to ponder upon this last question you probed here. And I'd like to agree with Professor Imtiaz Ahmed in Dhaka University. Actually, in his writing, he mentioned that the question of identity is more like something they have been forced to embrace. It's like, it's like a refuge for this community to embrace this identity. It was not mere voluntary choice. And while saying that, I'd like to also bring this to the forum that, as you mentioned, the role of social media. See, the way we frame someone, be it a community or a person or content, matters. And how, when, where we project someone, the points, the beginning, the ending, these all matter in this context, because the very, the question of identity, which actually kind of playing the role of legitimacy for the Myanmar government, is actually based on fallacious logic and historical records. So, the way media so far projected them probably is adding more to this problem, because, when I say this is a Rohingya crisis, Rohingya problem, probably isolating the problem makers, because this is not a Rohingya problem, as Professor Imtiaz emphasized on that. This is rather problem begin somewhere else. It's not Rohingya problem or Rohingya crisis. So the way we actually project this probably, take some responsibility. Thank you.
Anyone else, please?
Um, there was a comment, Your Excellency, for you, and that comment is simply, this is what it says: amazed to know about the initiatives from the United Kingdom. That's it. And Dr. Georgi is not here, but there was one question about misinformation. Can I open that up to anyone here who might have something to say, how we can combat misinformation, especially related to Rohingyas? Lecturer Masood, please.
Hello. Misinformation. Now we do not live only inside the architecture of misinformation. We have three types of information right now, which is disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation. I think these three types, basically the misinformation we are targeting is not misinformation, is malinformation. It's targeted, the author is somewhere located, and he is not open author. There's no authorship to misinformation. Who's the author? Is it the Myanmar government is talking, or the Myanmar civil society is talking, or ARSA is speaking? So we have to go for the old, model. I think the old model is very easy model. So that came from political communication. Who says what to whom with what intent? Very easy question. Who says what to whom with what intent? So we have to focus more on the intent of communication, the message. The message, presumably the message is pretty simple message. It is the Rohingyas are suffering in this camp, and let's balance the information, and let's go for the searching what is the fact. So we need to focus on fact, and it should not be, sometimes the government is very nervous about the information. They want to hide it, and they want to say something very, very super positive thing. So let's not hide that the Rohingyas are having problem. We are doing hugely for them, for their welfare, for their education. There's a serious problem relating to Rohingya education. We are teaching them Arabic, we are teaching them English a little bit, and Bangla. What about their mother tongue? If they want to go back, they won't be able to speak the Myanmar language. If they fail, the main issue is the language. Language is the marker, and there is the identity politics. They are being targeted at Muslim, quote unquote Muslim, and Bengali speaking. So it has to be other way around. They should be full citizen of the Myanmar. They should be Myanmar citizen, and they speak a different language. All right, like we have to deal with the Chittagong Hill Tracts. They are Chakma, they speak Chakma language. We have to endorse, there is a language called Chakma language, and there is a right, even when I love Bangla, that's my mother tongue, very sweet, but we should not impose Bangla on the Chakma people. We should help them learn multilingual South Asia. We should envision a multilingual South Asia where we can easily speak Hindi, we can easily learn Myanmar language. I think in Bangladesh, there is only one school which teaches Myanmar language, a university course. So there is no educational plan for the kids growing up in Bangladesh. The kids are now 3-year-old, but when they become older, they will face serious issues relating to education and language. So misinformation is an interesting thing. Information, there are a hell lot of definition of information. The simple is information reduces uncertainty. Information reduces uncertainty. Information is progress. So if it is not reducing uncertainty, if it is not leading us to progress, then there is a problem with the fidelity of information. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I do have one more question coming from Hussein Andalib, and this goes to Ms. Fumiko Kashiwa. And this is basically what is the UNHCR stance on the shift to Bhashanchar? Kindly.
Sorry, it took me a while to reconnect to the video. I hope now I'm connected. Thank you very much, Professor. No, thank you very much. And I think the question was directed to me, but it's indeed it's a UNHCR, but it's also for the UN consideration. And I think that was already mentioned that we've been discussing with the government and requesting us to be able to visit the island and to undertake assessment in a way of understanding of the situation. And I think I hear also some of the comments already made on the question of assessment, etc. But we believe it is still critically important for us to be able to do so for our purpose, of course, for better understanding of the situation, and also be able to continue a dialogue with authorities. Maybe there's something that is on the island we need to discuss, but maybe there's some also other issues that we would like to further seek clarity or dialogue with authorities. And this is also our accountability vis-a-vis the refugees, donors, and other communities that we've been supporting the work of the United Nations as well as for the Rohingya people. And it's also part of a due diligence that we always do when we work in new operation situations. So I think we remain hopeful that we will have a discussion and opportunity to visit the island and based on our dialogue with the authorities. So let me stop there.
Thank you so much for your contribution, Ms. Kashiwa. One final comment from you as we come to an end. Not from her. Yes, I do want to get to Professor Shahab because discussions with him really resulted in this conference. Please.
Thank you, sir. Just one quick point, or perhaps I would like to add a data on the social media that has just come to me. Very interestingly, globally, the Rohingya, the word Rohingya has been mentioned between January to July 2020 is 1.6 million times. And on the other hand, it is like per day, it is 7.83 thousand a month, a day. Now, this is 21% higher globally than the previous year. But very interestingly, when it came to Bangladesh's context, it was mentioned 64,000 times, which means 300 times a day, which is a reduction, 40% reduction from the previous year, which means the social media trend now shows that increasingly Bangladeshis are focusing on other things rather than Rohingya issue, which means the very Rohingya narrative is losing its momentum in social media, and that's probably what Professor Imtiaz was trying to highlight. Thank you, sir.
I would think the pandemic would have quite a bit to do with that. But any other response to that comment?
Can I come in?
If not, as we come towards a closure, can I request, in case there is one last comment, any of our honored guests or esteemed peers would like to make, kindly share them with us now.
I'll just say from here, thank you very much indeed to everyone who's been involved. I think it's been an extremely interesting morning. I'm surprised that I feel we talk a lot about what the UK is doing on Rohingyas, both on relief and return, but clearly the comment that you mentioned suggests that we should do even more of this, and conferences like this are an extremely good opportunity, I think, for us to discuss among ourselves what can be done. I think the thing I've found most interesting, I think, in some ways, is the discussion of Facebook and the social media platform, because there's no question that played a major part in creating the conditions for the atrocities of 2017. And I think, you know, we're seeing this all over the world, not just here, but I think the vulnerability of groups like the Rohingyas to social media-driven ethnic hatred is clearly a massive problem. And I think, you know, it goes beyond the scope of this, but this is a really extreme example. So very useful morning's discussion. Thank you very much indeed to everyone.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Would our Vice Chancellor Acting have anything to say? Or our Chairman, Board of Trustees? I do want to conclude this. I don't think I've mentioned everything here. I do want to mention that Professor Shahab has been central to this developing this conference here today. I do want to recognize him. And while I'm doing that in your corner of the world, I do want to recognize Ambassador Tarek, who is opening up the Center for Bay of Bengal Studies, which will in some way be involved with the Rohingyas at some point. And I hope we can hear from you. Please come to his panel tonight. And next on your...
Imtiaz Bhai, can I say, Imtiaz Bhai, this is Imtiaz.
Yes.
Before you conclude, can I say a word?
Absolutely, Imtiaz.
Okay. No, I just thought of contributing to the debate on misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. I love that immensely. There is a lesson from Hadith, actually, one can take, which is quite extraordinary, you know, why I'm saying that. You see, when we talk about Hadith, and those who are familiar, that sometimes some of the Hadiths can really make issues, and people would be very, what you call, very uncomfortable. And the way to resolve that is we have authentic Hadiths and we have weak Hadiths. And it's clearly mentioned, if the information, the source is not credible, then it's not an authentic hadith, and you can rule it out. And even in the context of women's power and women's what you call role in the Arab world, the weak hadiths have made quite an extraordinary kind of presence. But now writers, whether it's Fatima Marnisi and others, have really probed into those and found out that the information or the source is not credible, because that's how you trace the hadith. And so in an interesting way with the news, because we had a president in the United States who gave 30,000 lies, or more than 30,000 lies, as some of the reporters have identified. So you can see that it's at the highest level. It's not only at the mass level. Even a president of a very powerful country can do the same thing. So what I think is important now with social media, whoever is reading the social media or whoever is watching the social media, please go to the source, see whether the person is credible or not. Whether, where, when, how that has information. That's how you resolve the issue of misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. I thought to flag that because some of us here are familiar with the hadith source and how it is found. So I thought in some way this has come in an extraordinary time, particularly with the social media. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That comment really came from lecturer Masood, who I must say is our hidden talent and whose flower will really blossom in the years to come. I do want to, before you interrupted Imtiaz, I was going to go to your Dhaka University colleague. I would like our new incoming dean, Dr. Taibur Rahman, to please present yourself a little bit.
Last day of last day of 2020. Okay, so very happy to be here, and I have already met some of my colleagues from the school, and I have already started enjoying my time here, and this is an opportunity to know many of the colleagues here, and I was listening to the presentation in the morning. One point I just want to mention by taking the opportunity now that I think governance is a big issue related with how we will manage the 1.1 million Rohingya in Bangladesh. Because when we talk about governance, it involves many actors and institutions, including the government, private sector, international community. So we need to know how are we managing it, who are providing us the fund, how the funds are being utilized, how the funds are, used for undertaking many activities related with health, education, income generation. So I hope that at some point this issue will be discussed in this conference. Thank you so very much. Yeah.
You bet, it will be. Just a couple of comments before you go. I do want to recognize the incoming young faculty also helping with the conference. Would you stand up, please? Ryan, he's coming in from February, Global Studies. Moin, and Dr. Shahnawaz. Thank you all. Welcome aboard. And my final comment is this whole project has come from a book that we are all working on, many inside IUB and many outside. And I would like to mention that many of them will be presenting this afternoon what will be their chapters. I am taking 1 week off next week, and that is to harness those chapters and submit them for a book. So I would really like to appreciate and acknowledge their efforts. If you are here, any one of them, just stand up and show your faces. We will not hold it against you if you do. Dr. Niloy from Dhaka University, International Relations, and all of them. Thank you all so much. Please continue for the afternoon with us, 2 more panels. And if you want to come up and chat with our High Commissioner, please do so. Thank you.